Chapter 73. George Crosses for Everyone. Wednesday, March 4, 1996, Parliament Chamber, London, England. Next path. Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. Arthur Weasley looked around the room in wonder. He wasn't sure if he'd ever seen this many Muggles in one room at a time. He and the rest of the wizards were seated in the center of the room on what appeared to be Muggle folding chairs. He'd actually tried to take a closer look at one of him when a grunt from Reg Catamole alerted him to the fact that Muggles took these things for granted and that he'd look stupid examining the chair. Most of the wizards were wearing dress robes. Here and there, he saw a witch with an elegant dress or a wizard in a tuxedo. Judging by the clothes of the Muggles on the benches, he assumed that these wizards were Muggle-born or had Muggle spouses, and as a result knew what constituted formal wear in the Muggle world. Reg had been one of the wizards who had known enough to wear a tux. From what Arthur knew, Reg's Muggle in-laws had drilled Muggle customs into his head as a prerequisite for allowing him to marry their daughter. His experience with the Muggles had been more than welcome when he and Arthur had to take the Underground over to Parliament. Arthur had nearly been left behind at the turnstile for the second time in less than 12 months. As if that weren't bad enough, he'd blown out an emergency light on the subway car with a simple spell to help clean his robe. Cornelius Fudge had come by his office a week ago to deliver the invitation. Queen Elizabeth Roman II and Prime Minister Major had been elated that the wizards had come to help rescue people during the terrorist attack. They had argued, quite logically, that it was difficult for the wizards to overcome centuries of aloofness and come to the Muggles' aid. They obviously didn't know Arthur, who had been curious about Muggles for years and was just itching for a chance to interact with them. The Minister of Magic had explained that the Queen had invited all of the wizards who had taken part in the rescue to a special session of Parliament which would honor them for their bravery. Arthur had known that England had a queen. However, he didn't know much about Parliament. Reg had to explain the nature of Parliament to him as well. He couldn't understand how people could run a country simply by yelling at each other all the time. He shrugged. Muggles were strange. Maybe that was it. To be honest, Arthur was a little surprised that Fudge had even invited him. He had been in the minister's doghouse ever since he had contradicted the Ministry of Magic's party line on Voldemort in the presence of Jacob Gold. Cornelius was still saying that Voldemort hadn't returned and that all of the reports that he had were unsubstantiated. The only non-Death Eater who had supposedly seen him and survived had been Harry, and Fudge was more than fed up with the antics of the author of the Super Bowl breach. Harry had been a mischievous boy in the past, and this was no different. Word was starting to get around, however. Several people in the ministry were starting to become convinced that Voldemort, or at least a high-ranking Death Eater, had taken command. Strange things had been happening of late. First, Augustus Rookwood had been found dead, sprawled out in the Hall of Prophecy next to prophecy which supposedly referred to Voldemort and Harry Potter. It looked as if he had tried to listen to the prophecy and failed. Lucius Malfoy, a suspected Death Eater, had been absent more often than usual ever since the end of the Triwizard Tournament last year. Many people believed that Fudge was deliberately covering it up, either out of denial or to prevent a panic among the wizards of Britain. Although Fudge admitted that several odd events had transpired since the end of the Triwizard Tournament, starting with Cedric Diggory's death, he vehemently denied that they had been due to Voldemort's return. He kept on reiterating that Sirius Black was still at large and was capable of doing virtually anything. The Ministry had been forced to admit that it had underestimated Black's power. After all, only a prodigiously powerful wizard would have been able to break out of Professor Filch's office in Hogwarts, not to mention Azkaban to begin with, after he had been apprehended in the Shrieking Shack 2 years ago. Cornelius himself confessed that he didn't know exactly what Sirius had done. Whatever it was, though, it had been far beyond anything Cornelius could have imagined, and to do it right under Snape's nose was even more amazing. As far as Cedric's death was concerned, the obvious explanation was that he had fallen performing the final task. He wouldn't have been the first Triwizard contestant to die in the tournament. With two of the other three contestants out of the country and Harry in no position to talk, there was virtually no way to refute this allegation. Arthur looked down to the front of the room, where Fudge was waiting to meet the Queen and Prime Minister. Arthur would have liked to denounce Fudge in public here and now. Unfortunately, that would make the wizards look bad to the Muggles. Not to mention, of course, that he'd probably lose his job. Fudge was probably looking forward to several photo ops with the British leaders. It wasn't hard to figure out when the leaders were reported to be approaching the room. Virtually everyone in the room stood up and applauded as the Prime Minister was introduced. They all then bowed as the Queen walked in. Arthur wondered if Fudge would insist that everyone in the ministry start bowing to him. Some of the witches tried bowing as well and had to be gently reminded that women were supposed to curtsy. The Queen told everyone to rise, and they did. She then smiled and walked to the podium in the center of the room. The Prime Minister and Minister of Magic stood on either side of her. Behind her stood none other than Nigel Marcellus. It looked like he was doing double duty, serving both as a security guard and as a man who had been rescued by a wizard. The Queen looked around the room and began. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have assembled here today to express our most profound gratitude to a segment of society which had, until quite recently, been forced to hide itself from our presence. From what we have been told by Minister of Magic Cornelius Fudge, part of the reason for the statute of secrecy had been because in ancient days, people were afraid of magic and associated strange powers with the devil. The wizards had to isolate themselves from the Muggle population, simply because the Muggles would have persecuted them otherwise. We are certain that it may have been difficult for many of these witches and wizards to overcome their fear of Muggles, put their lives in danger, and help free people who had been trapped in the debris from the Canary Wharf attack. They likely never knew about the era, and as far as we know, the era has never posed a threat to their world. Yet they still came to our aid. As the Queen of England, we issue a formal apology for all of the persecution the wizarding community has suffered over the centuries in our realm." The entire audience clapped. Arthur felt embarrassed. He probably would have tried helping the Muggles even if Cornelius hadn't told him to go. It felt tacky to accept an award for something any decent man would have done. The Queen continued. "We have with us today someone who was rescued by the wizards, SAS Agent General Nigel Alexander Marcellus, retired. This man was working at 5 Canada Square when the building was attacked. He will now explain what happened to him and how he was rescued." The crowd clapped once more as Nigel walked to the podium. He was wearing what Arthur interpreted as an SAS officer's uniform. There were a few medals on his chest. He looked quite dashing. Nigel saluted the audience and began his story. "I had been having a rough day in my SAS job as a stockbroker and had gone outside to try to wake myself up in the cold air. When the bomb went off, my SAS training immediately kicked in, and I was able to determine where the epicenter of the blast had been. It had been in one of the parking lots. I had seen a truck with Irish plates in the area shortly before the blast and had found it bloody strange. It didn't take long for me to figure out that the era had been at it again. However, I nearly found myself unable to relay this information to the rest of the world. I found myself pinned by debris when the building came down. I tried to escape by tunneling through a snowbank, a common training exercise. However, when you're as old as I am, things don't work as well as they did when you were in your 20s. There were nervous titters in the crowd. Nigel looked for a moment, confused. Then the Prime Minister coughed and discreetly pointed at the Queen. Nigel's face went beet red, and he bowed. "I apologize, Your Majesty." The Queen actually grinned. "Don't worry, General. Each time I look at one of our banknotes, I realize that things don't work as well as they did when we were younger." Nigel nodded and wisely didn't respond. Instead, he continued with his story. I thought I was going to freeze down there. It was getting hard tunneling through the snow, and I couldn't push those beams off of me. My leg had been injured as well, which didn't help. The next thing I know, I hear this chap say some nonsense phrase, and the beams suddenly floated up into the air. I was surprised, to say the least. I was even more surprised when I discovered that my rescuers had been two wizards. I explained to them what had happened, and they called over a constable. I brought the constable over to the epicenter and showed him the remains of the truck. The constable agreed that it had all the hallmarks of an era car bomb. Meanwhile, the two wizards went off and started rescuing more people. Had it not been for those two men, I would likely have been seriously injured or killed. We all owe the wizards a great deal of gratitude. Everyone clapped once more as the Queen took the stand again. Thank you, General. We would now like to ask this man's rescuers, Wizard Arthur Joseph Weasley and Wizard Reginald Louis Catamole, to step forward so we can present them with the George Cross. The crowd cheered as Arthur's jaw dropped. What was he supposed to do? Who the bloody hell was George Cross? Nervous, he nodded to Reg, and they both headed up to the podium and bowed. The Queen then reached over and placed some kind of pin on his robe. It looked like a silver cross hanging from a black banner. He didn't know what it was, but judging from the reaction of the Muggles, it seemed important. The Queen then bade them rise, shook their hands, posed for photo ops, and had them go back to their seats. The Queen smiled. Congratulations, Wizards Weasley and Catamole. She then turned to Cornelius Fudge. Minister of Magic Fudge, would you be so good as to kneel so I can give you your cross? The minister did so, and everyone clapped again. Arthur had a bad feeling that Fudge would start yelling at him for getting his award before Fudge himself did. With that, Fudge rose and then turned to the rest of the wizards in the room. Thank you, Your Majesty. And now, if the rest of you chaps would be willing to line up, we'll hand out the GCs to the rest of you. Chapter 74. The Saudi Wizard. Thursday, March 5, 1996, Audience Chamber Royal Palace Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. King Fahd looked up from his desk as the messenger entered his office and bowed. You may rise, Abdul. What's going on? Your Majesty, Wizard Dagher has arrived. Shall I send him in? The king nodded. Of course. We shouldn't keep him waiting. After all, he did save my life. The kingdom owes him a great deal of gratitude. The servant bowed once more. Yes, Your Majesty. The king recalled the momentous events which had transpired earlier in the year. On New Year's Day, he had suffered a serious stroke and had nearly died. According to Prince Abdullah's report, the doctors had told the prince that there was nothing that could be done, and that the king would lie in a vegetative state for the rest of his life. They had turned to the prince and asked him for permission to euthanize the king. Meanwhile, Imam Ibrahim had been hustled into the sick room to minister to the patient and the soon-to-be grieving family. That was when the man had suddenly materialized in the room. During the few seconds of shock between his arrival and the prince's inevitable command to summon the guards, the visitor had held out his hands, bowed to the prince, and pleaded, Your Highness, in Allah's name, listen. I'm here to help. Hear me out. The prince had stared at him. Who are you? How'd you get past the guards? I'm Wizard Haydar Aziz Dagher. I'm your father's Minister of Magic. The prince's jaw had dropped. My father's what? Minister of Magic. I'm in charge of the wizards in the realm. I know, you probably didn't know about it. The only person who knows is the king. However, we can't deal with this right now. This is an emergency, and we don't have time. Am I correct in assuming that you have concluded that you can't save His Majesty? The prince had stared at him skeptically. Yes, let me guess. You're going to say you can heal him with magic. The minister had shaken his head. I can't, Your Majesty. However, we have a healer, Dihar Maluf, who can. With your permission, Your Highness, I will summon him and have him go to work. Realizing that there had been no other option, the prince had been about to give his consent when another voice had broken in. Blasphemy, witchcraft, kill him. The prince had cursed, having forgotten the imam. Well, Abdullah had dealt with him. The prince had immediately summoned the guards and told the cleric that if he didn't shut up he'd be with Allah in 5 minutes. Said may have loved Allah, but apparently he didn't love him enough to want to visit him that quickly. Once the imam was dealt with, the prince had given the wizard the go-ahead. Seconds later, a second wizard had materialized in the room and brought out something which looked like a small cylinder. The guards had hissed and looked at the prince sharply, but the prince had waved them off. Abdullah had later told the king that it wouldn't have made sense for the wizards to try to kill him, as they hadn't needed his help to send him to Allah at the rate things were going. The second wizard had then pointed the wand at him and muttered arcane words. Whatever they weren't Arabic. A few minutes later, he had nodded to the first wizard and bowed to Abdullah. He then spoke words which Abdullah had told him he'd never forget. Your Highness, the king has been stabilized. You may now confirm it with your doctors. You should keep him under observation for a month or so. It was very touch and go there. However, he'll make it. The doctors had looked at the readouts for a few moments as the prince looked on in incredulity. The doctors' eyebrows had shot up, and they reported that the king had been stabilized. The prince had thanked the wizards profusely. Meanwhile, the imam had fallen to the floor in a dead faint. Unable to determine whether to praise Allah for a miracle or curse the wizards for endangering the king's soul that had been 2 months ago. The government had sent out an announcement announcing the king's recovery a month after the incident, once His Majesty had gotten out of the hospital. Fearful of an Islamic backlash against the wizards, Minister Dagher had recommended that the king leave the wizards' role out of it, until both parties believed that the clergy was ready to deal with wizards in their midst. Judging from what he'd heard from Minister Dagher, it was clear that these wizards would be a benefit to society. All he had to do was get the fundamentalists to buy in. He had heard bin Laden's request for jihadist wizards. Putting wizards in charge of Al-Qaeda would be very bad. Bin Laden was bad enough. A new bin Laden casting spells, that would be a lot worse. Al-Qaeda had to be dealt with, and dealt with soon, hence this special mission. The door opened once again, and Wizard Dagher walked into the room and bowed. You wish to see me, Your Majesty? Yes, Minister. Close the door, please. There's something I need to talk to you about, something which cannot be divulged to Muggles. The wizard nodded, brought out his wand, and waved it around for a moment. A couple of seconds later, he nodded. Our conversation is secure, Your Majesty. I take it you want the Ministry of Magic to do something that certain Muggles should not be made aware of. Yes, particularly a Muggle named Osama bin Laden. I take it you are familiar enough with the Muggle word to be familiar with this man. The minister grimaced. Yes, Your Majesty. I hope Allah takes him soon. The king grinned. I don't think you need to worry about that, Minister. I doubt Allah will actually want him. I suspect that he's going to send bin Laden somewhere where he doesn't really want to go. At any rate, I was wondering if you could do us a favor involving bin Laden. You see, Allah probably doesn't want him on this earth. I want you to fulfill his will and expedite this process. The wizard stared at him. You want us to sneak a man into Al-Qaeda and assassinate bin Laden? Yes, Minister. You're probably aware that bin Laden has been trying to recruit jihadist wizards. I know what you can do, Minister. Trust me, we don't want wizards in Al-Qaeda. I need bin Laden taken out and Al-Qaeda disbanded before he does so. The wizard nodded. I understand, Your Majesty. Good, can it be done? Yes, Your Majesty. We possess invisibility cloaks and are capable of modifying people's memories so that they don't realize we've been around. That's how we handled statute of secrecy breaches in the past. There is one complication, however. The king frowned, and that is... Dagher took a deep breath. Unless you want one of us to take over Al-Qaeda and disband it, which I would not recommend, as a wizard takeover would just be fodder for the jihadists, we would have to hit bin Laden with Avada Kedavra and perform the Imperious Curse on bin Laden's second, and ensure that he follows our orders. The Imperious Curse. And what's Avada Kedavra? The Imperious Curse allows us to brainwash the victim and force him to do exactly what we tell him. Avada Kedavra kills painlessly, leaving no evidence of magic or Muggle explanation of how the victim died. The king smiled. Sounds all right with me. What's wrong with that? The use of the Imperious Curse and Avada Kedavra is forbidden, Your Majesty. There are actually 3 forbidden curses: brainwashing, torture, and execution. We can't use them, and it would be a disaster if we did it, and people found out, especially now that Muggles are aware of our existence. The king smiled. I'm giving you permission. This is an emergency, after all. Make it a black operation. If you can do that, you're home free. The wizard squirmed. I don't like black ops, especially now that the Muggles know wizards exist. However, if that's your command, we'll do it. It is. Good luck, Minister. Thank you, Your Majesty. I know the perfect assassin. You'll know when the deed is done. Allah willing, the whole world will know. That's all that I can ask for. May Allah be with you. Dismissed. Chapter 75. Eating Wild Turkeys. Friday, March 6, 1996, Oval Office, White House, Washington, DC, United States of America. Next Pav. Jason Morgenstern Travis Radner had met President Clinton before and knew how to react when he was introduced to arguably the most powerful man in the world. If anything, Clinton had been caught more off guard than he had been. Then again, of course, Clinton hadn't realized wizards existed until he had been first elected president back in 1992. The 2 other members of the delegation, however, were a bit more nervous. Morgan Dresden, head of the Chicago Wizarding Institute, was accustomed to dealing with important officials. However, he wasn't entirely sure how to handle Muggles. Most of the stuff Dresden knew about Muggles came from Robert Bob Burke, a ghost of an early 19th century wizard who had lived a Muggle life as a farmer in what was then the Far West. Bob had done what he could, but even he found himself at a loss when it came to things like computers and airplanes. The closest Dresden had gotten to learning from a living Muggle was when that Jim Butcher fellow from Missouri had somehow managed to break into an office of the CWI and learn more than he was supposed to about CY's operations. Dresden was kicking himself for mangling Butcher's memories into data appropriate for a fantasy novel too quickly. Had he spent more time interviewing Butcher, he'd have gotten more information on how to interact with Muggles. There was no way he could have known, however, that the statute of secrecy would have fallen a short time after the interview. Had he been placed in the same situation again, he would have likely done the same thing. The 3rd member of the delegation was a Muggle who was more than familiar with President Clinton. Claire Cox was still in her wheelchair, though both the wizards and Muggle doctors believed that she would be walking on her own again pretty soon, albeit with crutches for the time being. Her first problem was that she was a devout Christian and had voted against Clinton in the 1992 election. Second, she was often intimidated by people in authority. A sitting president whom she had voted against was about as tough for her as it could get. She tried to reassure herself, however, that if the November election went as she hoped, Dole would take over and get rid of the Democrat. Finally, she was nervous because she didn't know what exactly she was supposed to do when visiting such an illustrious person. This put her in the same boat, so to speak, as Dresden, albeit for a completely different reason. Radner hoped that the delegation would be able to keep itself under control long enough for him to get his message across. If having Cox and Dresden in the room didn't help, nothing would. The door on the other side of the room opened, revealing a chubby, long-haired woman with a daringly low neckline. She nodded to him and gestured towards the door. Secretary Radner, the president will see you now. Go on in. Radner got up, followed quickly by Dresden. He couldn't understand how a young woman like this managed to get a coveted position so close to the president. He shrugged. Muggles often acted strange. Thank you, Miss Lewinsky. You can wait for us outside. Lewinsky nodded. With pleasure, Mr. Secretary. With that, the intern moved aside, and Radner led Dresden into the Oval Office, propelling Cox's wheelchair with his wand. The president had a big smile on his face. He must have been having a good day, Radner thought. Maybe he'll be more willing to help us. He kept this in the back of his mind. Clinton stood and shook his hand. Welcome to the Oval Office, Secretary Radner. When I heard that you wanted to speak with me, I figured it had been prompted by the attack in Kansas. Is that correct? Radner nodded. Yes, Mr. President. Allow me to introduce my colleagues here. The man is Wizard Morgan Dresden of the Chicago Wizarding Institute. Clinton pursed his lips. That's the North Central headquarters of the Department of Magic, if I recall correctly. Correct, Mr. President. The woman in the wheelchair is Claire Cox, the woman who was attacked by the America for Humans mob. The president shook the other two people's hands. Welcome to the Oval Office, lady and gentleman. Can I get you anything to drink? Both wizards asked for water. Claire, however, asked for a wild turkey. At this, Dresden's eyebrows shot up and he turned to her. Mrs. Cox, how can you drink a wild turkey? You can't drink poultry. Is that a Muggle custom? Both Radner and the president laughed at this. Radner explained. Wild turkey is a brand of alcoholic beverage which is not unpopular among Muggles. It has a higher alcohol content than we permit for consumption by wizards. Clinton grunted approvingly. Sounds like you don't allow beverages with a high alcohol content in the wizarding community. Butterbeer, if I recall, is relatively mild. Radner nodded. Yes, Mr. President. Spellcasting and alcohol don't mix well, and everything more alcoholic than the 90th percentile of butterbeer brand's alcohol content is regulated by my department. Slur one word or have your wand slip, and you can blow yourself to kingdom come. We try to regulate it as best as we can, but occasionally things get through. That's how things like spontaneous human combustion occur, in which people get killed under mysterious circumstances. Speaking of people getting killed, is it wise to have Miss Lewinsky as your final line of defense? She seems young and inexperienced, and I know she's not a wizard. Clinton laughed. She's got all the experience she needs for her job, Mr. Radner. She isn't around for security duty. That's what the Secret Service is for. Radner nodded. I'm glad to hear that, Mr. President. At any rate, here's what I've come to talk to you about. As you suspected, it's about America for Humans. They're starting to become a rather dangerous nuisance. Morgan, will you do the honors? Dresden nodded. Yes, Mr. Secretary. Mr. President, we have reason to believe that America for Humans is growing rapidly. I'm not sure if you've been paying attention. The group, after all, it's just one hate group among many Muggle hate groups. However, it's been one of the North Central Wizarding region's main focuses ever since Mrs. Cox here was attacked in Westboro. Over the past few days, a good 2/3 of the members of Fred Phelps's Westboro Baptist Church have started working for America for Humans. Clinton frowned. That would be bad if it's true. I'll have to check that out. However, from what I know, Phelps's church discourages attacks on innocent people, claiming that it's not Christian to do so. Radner cut back in. That is indeed the case, Mr. President. Unfortunately, Phelps's interpretation of the Bible indicates that although Muggles cannot be targeted, wizards are fair game. As a result, most of his congregation has allied itself with Patrick Dursley Burgess and his movement. As if that's not bad enough, he's taken a page out of Osama bin Laden's book and is trying to recruit wizards to turn on their colleagues and join his cause in order to save them from AF persecution. The president uttered a most unpresidential four-letter word. Claire Cox's eyes widened. My thoughts exactly, Mr. President. However, it's getting worse. America for Humans chapters are springing up all over the Midwest and South. Chairwoman Santana of Big Thicket reports that 3 new chapters were founded this past week in her region, and Chief Two Bear of Fourth Mesa claims a couple more were just started up in his. As if that's not bad enough, Dursley Burgess's cousin Vernon has started one up in Britain under the name Britain for Humans. The president didn't mince words. Crap, I didn't realize it was that bad. Oh, Mr. President, it gets worse still. Phelps threw in a major monkey wrench when he declared the Pope the false prophet. I take it you are familiar with Christian eschatology. Yes, Mr. Radner, I am. The false prophet is the herald of the Antichrist. Correct, Mr. President. At the rate things are going, these hotheads are going to precipitate a war between Muggles and wizards. Such a war would be disastrous to both parties, as wizards can wield immense power. We don't like using it, and take care to forbid the most extreme curses. However, wizards may get desperate if they're backed into a corner. Phelps's announcement could trigger attacks on the Pope and possibly Catholics across the country as well. Radner grinned sadly. I must confess, though, that the only thing good that came out of Phelps's announcement is that he seems to have directed their attention away from me for the time being. You see, I was the man Pitmoss thought was the false prophet. Dresden chimed in. Mr. President, is there any way you can help us? We don't want to start attacking Muggles with magic, even in self-defense. Once we start cursing Muggles in self-defense, America for Humans will spin the news report around, say we were the aggressors, and claim that they were right all along. At that point, you'll probably get the apocalypse regardless of whether I am the false prophet or not. Clinton nodded. I think I'll be able to help out. Which of your sites are in need of protection? I can send National Guard troops out there to prevent people from entering without magical means. Thank God we're not at war right now. My thoughts exactly, Mr. President. Here's what I recommend. Prevent the Muggles from visiting the Big Thicket Natural Preserve or the Ocala National Forest. Close down the part of the Smoky Mountain National Park near our facility there and place a military base near Fourth Mesa. Clinton shook his head. We can't put a base near Fourth Mesa. That's Navajo territory. I'll try to talk to the tribe, though. Maybe they can think of something. That would be most appreciated, Mr. President. This leaves 3 more locations. Mount St. Helens is easy. Say there's a volcano alert, and it's off limits. We don't want to have the mountain blow its top again like in 1980. Clinton stared at him. You did that. Radner nodded. Yes, Mr. President. There was a minor breach of the statute then, and Wizard Eubanks, who's in charge of the Mount St. Helens facility, felt like he had no choice. The other 2 facilities, however, are going to be hard. The main office of the CWI is hiding, unplottable, in downtown Chicago. I don't know how Jim Butcher got in, but the fact that he did makes it complicated. Maybe you can buy up a lot of the buildings there. Radner paused. This leaves the Quabbin. The wizarding capital in Dana and the rest of the 4 towns are all underwater. However, boats occasionally go fishing out there. You don't want them dropping things other than fishhooks in the water. A breach of the shields protecting the cities from the water above, though unlikely, would be disastrous. Clinton nodded. I agree. What do you say about me declaring that the Quabbin is off limits because of water pollution issues from the boats? Radner nodded. That would work quite well, I think. This covers all of the main locations. As far as the Catholics go, you can try to institute a program protecting churches, synagogues, and other places of worship. Finally, you may want to close some other locations as well, just in case. If only 7 locations are closed, America for Humans will probably figure out that something fishy is going on there and may attack. If you close 50, however, we may be able to deal with it. Clinton shook his head. The people won't like that. It has to be done, however. Can you do it? Clinton sighed. I'll do what I can. Let's hope I still get re-elected in the fall. Radner smiled. We hope you are as well, Mr. President. You seem to be getting along with us pretty well. Clinton's eyes shot up for a moment. Same here, Mr. Radner. I hope we'll be able to work together more in the future. Hey, that gives me an idea. Maybe you can. Radner shook his head. No, Mr. President, we cannot influence Muggle politics. It would be inappropriate. Clinton sighed. It was worth a try, I guess. Bummer. Chapter 76. Guinevere makes an entrance. March 6, 1996, Alpha Chi Gamma, Fraternity Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cambridge. Massachusetts, United States of America. Jason Morgenstern knew that his date had arrived. It's not like it would have been easy to miss. The entire frat was abuzz. It wasn't often that a freshman looking out the window raced back into the common room, claiming that a witch was circling the building on a flying carpet. By the time Jason and the rest of the brothers made it down the stairs and out the door, they found themselves barely able to open the door due to all of the other students jamming the courtyard in front of the frat, craning their necks to look up into the sky. Jason looked up just in time to see another flying object appear of nowhere. The crowd gasped and pointed as it approached the flying carpet. His jaw dropped when he realized who it was. It was the Russian house witch. Good thing he brought her broom back, he thought. Jason was startled to see her nearly fall off her broom when she realized what Guinevere was flying. Jason watched as Guinevere waved at the Russian house witch. Ha! Another witch. I didn't know there were many witches out here. Wait, you're the Russian house witch, right? The Russian woman nodded at her. Yes, I'm the so-called Russian house witch. I've been hiding my abilities successfully over the past few years. A few people know I was involved with a Wiccan group, but that's it. I tried not to advertise that all that much because some religious people I know may not have liked it. Guinevere frowned. You're both a witch and a Wiccan. They're not the same thing, you know. Wicca is a system of beliefs and traditions. Magic is an ability. Yes, I know, the Muggles tend to conflate the two, but I actually am both. I'm also from one of the mainstream religions as well. So am I. I'm Guinevere de Mornay, a recent graduate from the Salem Witches Institute. What's your name? Have you ever seen a magic carpet before? The Russian had just finished introducing herself when her eyes fell on the carpet. Her jaw dropped. Pointing at the carpet, she exclaimed, "That's a pretty expensive oriental rug. How much did it cost?" Guinevere smirked. "About $3,500. In other words, 9 ounces worth of gold coins. I must say that pawn shop in Central Square was a bit surprised that I was exchanging so much gold." The Russian house witch stared at Guinevere and suddenly started laughing uncontrollably. "You took some of your galleons and sold them for their metal content to Muggles." "Correct, my friend. Last time I checked, gold was running about $400 ounce." The Russian woman shook her head and grinned evilly. Jason realized what she was thinking. MIT tuition was around $30,000 a year. That was a lot of money. Young witches like Guinevere often had a few hundred free galleons to their name. In the wizarding world, that wasn't that much money. In the Muggle world, however, he wondered if the Muggles would catch on, and if either he or the Russian witch would suddenly find that they had an easy way to pay for tuition. He'd have to act fast in order to pay everything off before gold prices crashed due to the excess of galleons. The Muggles around him were still staring up at the two women. Most of them didn't know much about the wizarding monetary system. They had no idea that the two wizards were discussing instant wealth. For all Jason knew, they thought that they were referring to Spanish shipwrecks. Guinevere nodded. "My thoughts exactly. I'm just waiting to see how Muggles are going to react when someone gives them leprechaun gold." Both women were laughing uncontrollably at this point. However, they soon came back to reality as several reporters and police cars suddenly turned around McCormick and headed down Amherst Alley. The Russian house witch cursed. "Damn, another interview. I think we'd better get going. What brings you down here?" Guinevere gestured in the general vicinity of Alpha Chi Gamma. "I've got a date with an Ack man tonight. That's the one between Deke and Otto, right?" The Russian nodded. "Does he know you're a witch?" "Absolutely." He found the idea quite intriguing, to say the least. With that, the two women shook hands and separated. The Russian woman landed on the roof of New House and raced down the stairs just before the reporters got to the door. A brief spell on the door to New House won safely and securely barred the door, much to the chagrin of about 8 Chocolate City men who suddenly found they were having trouble getting out of their building. Jason braced himself as the reporters crowded under Guinevere. The Newswise would have a field day with this. How was she going to get to him without having to hex away some of the reporters? There certainly wasn't anywhere for her to land near him. She scanned the crowd beneath her, looking for him. Of course, that was when every single Delta Kappa Epsilon, Alpha Chi Gamma, and Alpha Tau Omega man started waving frantically at her to try to get her to pick him up. Eventually, she saw him and pointed her wand at him. Levicorpus! Jason shrieked as he suddenly flew into the air. Reports spun and pointed their cameras at him. A few seconds later, he landed with a thud on the magic carpet. Making sure he was safe and sound, the carpet flew away, leaving the shocked bystanders clustered in front of the frats. Jason massaged his rear end and stared at her. I must say, Guinevere, you sure know how to make an entrance. Indeed I do, Jason. I figured we'd head out to an island somewhere where people won't be able to bother us. I'll put a disillusionment charm on us so that no one will be able to see us unless they're using video equipment. I'll cast a spell which will warm up the area under the carpet. And if they don't know where to look, too bad for them. Sorry about the Levicorpus spell, I didn't have anywhere to land. Now, if you'll hold on a second, I'll cast the disillusionment charm. She brought out her wands and muttered a few words. She looked around for a moment, satisfied, and started directing the carpet over to the harbor. Once she was happy where the carpet was going, she turned back to Jason and presented him with a little box. Jason looked at the box. What is it? She pointed at the box. Open it. It's your first magical item. Jason stared at the box. A magic item, just for him, perfect. He tore away the wrapping paper and uncovered a small spherical object. It looked like a little transparent ball. He picked it up to get a better look and was astonished when it turned red. He twisted it around to look at it more. What is it? It's a remembrall. I brought it to make sure you don't forget me. It's a magical object. If you ever forget something, it will turn red like it is now. Once you remember what you forgot, it will turn clear again. Jason hummed in appreciation. This may be useful for exams. Aloud, he asked, does this mean I've forgotten something? She nodded. Yup, do you have everything? I see you've got your jacket, clothing, and so forth. Check to see if there's something you're missing. Uneasy, Jason started rummaging through his pockets. It didn't take a while until he realized what was missing. He winced and turned, pleadingly, to Guinevere. You wouldn't by chance have a spell which will unlock the front door of the frat, start my car, and get into my mother's house, would you? Chapter 77, Osama Plots. March 7, 1996, Al-Qaeda headquarters Afghanistan/Pakistan border. Osama bin Laden looked at the latest list of recruits. There were now 20 new names on the list, 13 men and 7 women. He had interviewed many of the men personally and administered the oath of initiation. All of the men had passed all of the necessary mental and physical exams required to be an Al-Qaeda operative. They were all dedicated and disciplined enough to follow orders unquestioningly, and were willing to commit murder or suicide if necessary. The men were from all over the Arab world. 5 were from Afghanistan, 3 were from Pakistan, 2 from Iraq, 1 from Morocco, 1 from Syria, and 1 from Saudi Arabia. One of the people running the boot camp had noted that the Saudi recruit had been extremely impressive, able to run with a 20-kilo knapsack on his back without having to break out a sweat. Not only that, he appeared to be extremely strong and focused in everything he did. Osama hadn't actually interviewed the Saudi, but the man who it had been absolutely bowled over. The Saudi was also a master of disguise. He was very good at thinking up fake costumes and seemed to be able to make himself blend into everything. He also liked to hide his strong physical stamina from his marks by stooping a little and carrying around a walking stick, which he never let out of his hand. Bin Laden planned to promote him if he survived his first few assignments. The declaration of jihad against the wizards and served him well. However, there was one thing which had not worked out for him. None of the new recruits were wizards who had seen the light of Allah and decided to use their abilities in his name. He wondered if it would take a few attacks on wizarding targets to encourage the wizards to start siding with him. Bin Laden really wanted to send a suicide bomber into a wizarding area. However, most of them were in secret locations where Muggles couldn't go. The few that he knew were underwater, invisible to Muggles, or hidden in mountains or volcanoes. Sure, there was a link between the American Department of Magic and a MIT dormitory, but how the hell was he going to get someone into the dorm? The only person who'd have had a chance of getting in there would be Afia Siddiqui, but she had graduated MIT the previous year. He supposed he could tell her to tell everyone she was visiting a friend in MacGregor. Getting her into the dorm, however, was only part of the problem. Presumably, the wizards had security arrangements preventing Muggles from entering Ientry without explicit permission. Siddiqui wouldn't be able to do much good if the Ientry door were closed in her face. An idea came to him. If she were able to get into dorms but not into Ientry, maybe she could take out the MIT student who had come out as a witch. He'd compiled a decent amount of information on this witch. There were problems with this, however, as well. First, the student was supposedly a junior or senior, so Afia may have as little as 3 months left to trap her in her room and take her out. Furthermore, the witch was a member of a sorority, and a couple of the larger sororities had houses. What would happen if Afia finally managed to break in and found that the witch was out at some sorority gathering? Afia would have to get into the sorority house, which may not be easy, and even if she got in there, the witch's sisters would undoubtedly protect her. There was also the possibility that Afia knew the witch. Would she be willing to kill one of her friends? On the other hand, an acquaintanceship would make it easier for her to reach the witch. Lastly, there was the possibility of magic. Bin Laden had no idea what this witch could do. She had a broom and she knew how to fly it. Even worse, she was more than familiar with technology, having gone to MIT. A witch who could wield both magic and technology. Allah himself would probably have a problem with her. The only bright side Bin Laden could think of would be that she may be too hooked on technology to use magic too much. And once Afia was in the dorm, she could open the door for further operatives. This operation could work, he thought. Perhaps he can send some of the new female recruits after her at some point. It would probably take a couple of months to organize something like this, but it could just work. It would probably be hell of a lot easier to organize than the scheme he'd been toying with of flying airplanes into buildings. He hadn't interviewed any of the women, it would have been inappropriate. However, the female recruiter had assured him that all 7 women were more than capable of taking out the witch with a rifle shot or something like that. The recruiter claimed that the best place for an attack would be a private sorority gathering, where the agents would not have to wear a burqa in public to identify them as Muslims. Bin Laden had recommended that the agents not wear the burqas to this assignment. This had shocked the recruiter for a while, but eventually she agreed. The terrorist mastermind had just finished jotting down notes on the new recruits when he heard a knock on his door. He frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. What was going on? He looked up from his desk. Who is it? Ismail, sir. It was Ismail, all right. Bin Laden recognized his voice. The man didn't seem particularly frightened, though. If anything, he seemed excited. He disarmed the security protocol for the door and told him to enter. Ismail came in and saluted his leader sharply. At ease, Ismail. Report. In response, Ismail handed over a sheet of paper. This, sir. I believe we may have found ourselves an ally in the United States. Bin Laden stared at him. An ally in the United States? Who? A group called America for Humans. America for Humans? Odd name. How do you believe they would be of use to us? Sir, their primary platform involves the destruction and/or conversion of wizards. You may be interested to know that they got the idea of converting wizards to Christianity from your speech. Osama rolled his eyes. Converting wizards, yes. Converting them to Christianity, no. We've got enough crusaders to deal with as it is. Why would they join us? Ismail grinned. They won't join us intentionally, sir. However, both of us have a common enemy, American Christian wizards. I recommend that we have one of our men infiltrate their organization and assist them in attacking their targets. They've got foot soldiers, so we don't have to waste our own men. We give them our weapons and tell them what to do, and they'll be more than happy to do our dirty work for them. Osama shook his head. I see where you're heading. They won't follow Muslims, though, particularly if they mention they're members of Al-Qaeda. If anything, they'll attack us with our own weapons. Not if we use American agents and don't tell them we're part of Al-Qaeda. We'll tell them that we're some part of some obscure anti-wizard militia which just found out about America for humans and wants to join up. We've got weapons, and they've got fervor. They'll bite. Trust me. Osama thought about it as Ismail continued. There's more, sir. We'll tell them the weapons are less powerful than they actually are. When they go off, the group will be more than happy and pleasantly surprised. The agents will look like heroes in their eyes. A powerful attack will also rattle the American psyche and hopefully inspire the people to turn against their own wizards. The resulting chaos could distract the Clinton administration from actually prosecuting us. It will give us time to organize our own signature attacks, such as the airplane attack. Osama continued the man's thought. You may be onto something. If the group gets captured, they have no idea we were involved, so we get away scot-free. We'll have to warn our agents that we'll have to disavow any involvement if they are captured, but they're probably going to be okay with that. On the other hand, if the attack succeeds, our agents will, as you said, be seen as heroes. America for humans will probably depend on us to get them more weapons and training. If we decide to withhold our weapons, unless they attack certain targets which are more to our advantage. Ismail finished the thought. We'll effectively have a front in the United States. Eventually, we'll have them pull off a really big attack which will kill off most of the group unexpectedly, of course, and then we'll reveal that we're really members of Al-Qaeda and we were just using America for humans. Then they'll know who really is running the show. Osama nodded. Sound thinking, Ismail. Oh, it gets better, sir. You see, the two main leaders of America for humans are two radical pastors in Westboro, Kansas, Fred Phelps and Stephen Pitmoss. Pitmoss isn't against using weapons against witches and has already attempted to burn someone suspected of witchcraft. And Phelps has already accused the Pope of being the false prophet. Remember, he's a wizard. Bin Laden grunted. All modern prophets are false. Muhammad was the last true prophet. That's not what I meant, sir. The false prophet is considered a herald of the Antichrist in Christian law, a sign that the end of days is coming. The point is, Phelps's group is more than willing to attack Catholics, the ultimate crusaders. I believe you've considered attacks on Catholics as well, if you're not mistaken. Osama nodded. I have. I must say, though, that a wizard pope probably means that the end of days is probably upon us. Allah would have to come down himself to get rid of someone like that. At any rate, though, this sounds like a good idea. Go ahead and see what you can do. Find agents who are American rednecks if possible, and do not look Muslim. May Allah be with you, Ismail. Ismail nodded. May he be with you, sir. Thank you, Ismail. Oh, before I forget, when you get a chance, get me in touch with Afia Siddiqui. I may have an assignment for her, and perhaps America for humans as well. Chapter 78. Hagrid and Trelawney sacked. March 8, 1996. Care of Magical Creatures Classroom Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry Great Britain Rubius Hagrid patted Sleipnir the unicorn. Umbridge was so wrong about these animals, he thought. Sure, if you surprised a unicorn or threatened them, they'd do nasty things to you. But if you were nice to them and got them accustomed to humans, they'd consider you to be part of their herd and would be very friendly. The American Minister of Magic, well, as they called him Secretary of Magic, must have known that, as he had given President Clinton a unicorn. Surely Cornelius Fudge would have known this as well. In that case, why didn't he tell Dolores Umbridge? It would have made things a hell of a lot easier. The unicorn neighed and turned to look at the fruit basket. Hagrid got the point immediately. He headed over to the fruit basket to pick out an apple. That's when he saw the note on the fruit basket. It was in Umbridge's handwriting and decorated with meowing cats. "Come to my office immediately." Hagrid frowned. What was this? Was she still holding a grudge against him from when he had confronted her over Sleipnir? He wouldn't be surprised, given how much of a jerk she was. Maybe she was trying to impose her authority over him again. Puzzled, he waited until the end of his current class and headed over to Umbridge's office. He knocked on the door, and she let him in. She was not alone. There were 5 burly men in the office with her. Ministry officials, he suspected, or perhaps auras. He had no idea what they were doing there. Perhaps she was concerned students and staff might try to rebel against her increasing authority. He'd find out soon enough, he supposed. He nodded to Umbridge. "You wished to see me, headmistress?" Umbridge nodded. "Indeed, I have, Hagrid. I've called this meeting to inform you that you have been terminated. You are no longer a professor at this school. You have until the rest of the day to pack up your belongings. These men are trained auras and will help you on your way." Hagrid stared at her. "What? You can't get rid of me. On what grounds are you letting me go?" Umbridge smiled sweetly at him. "You're too insolent, and you expose the students to dangerous creatures like unicorns. There are creatures out in the forest which can be a threat to these students, yet you treat them like friends and claim that they'll be all right. But they're misunderstood." Umbridge shook her head. "Tell that to Draco Malfoy, who was bitten by your tame hippogriff. A hippogriff which should have been executed 2 years ago, had things gone as planned. The Ministry is still unsure how he escaped." Hagrid longed to punch her in the nose and barely restrained himself. "What are you talking about?" Draco Malfoy provoked Buckbeak. "That's what you would like to think, Hagrid. However, Cornelius knows what really happened. After all, Lucius is an important ministry official, and Cornelius has his ear." Bloody hell, he thought. It was all politics. Lucius was going to be using his political clout to frame Hagrid for the Buckbeak incident. Hagrid knew that he and Umbridge hadn't seen eye to eye, but he had hoped it wouldn't be this bad. Umbridge hesitated for a moment, and then said, "If it makes you feel any better, you're not going to be the only teacher dismissed today. Professor Trelawney has also been let go. She claims she's a seer, but she doesn't seem to have any idea how to actually see into the future." Hagrid shook his head. "That's not the way seers work, headmistress. They're more along the lines of oracles, spontaneously reciting prophecies. They can't prophesy on demand." Umbridge didn't buy it. "That's what you say. However, how would you know? You're not a seer. Now I'd recommend you start packing. You've got until the end of the day." Hagrid didn't like where this was going. "Can I at least have a second chance?" "No, Hagrid. You've been reviewed several times and haven't improved. Goodbye." "Who's going to teach divination and care of magical creatures when we're gone?" Umbridge looked at a piece of parchment in front of her. "Professor Grubblyplank will be taking over for you. Divination is going to be discontinued permanently, as it obviously doesn't work. It is going to be replaced with additional Muggle studies classes now that the statute of secrecy has been breached." Hagrid glared at her. "Professor Grubblyplank has no experience with some of the creatures in the forest, headmistress. Some of them will only talk to me." Umbridge shrugged. "If she runs into any of those, I'm sure that a more capable staff member in this building will be more than willing to exterminate them. Why, I've even heard rumors there's a giant out there. I suspect it will take multiple auras to bring it down." Hagrid was barely able to contain his anger. "Now hold on a second. Grop is my brother. You can't touch him. He's gentle." One of the Aurors muttered something. Seconds later, all 5 men pointed their wands at him and muttered incantations. Hagrid felt his body freeze solid and topple to the ground. From somewhere above his head, Umbridge said, "Just as gentle as that hippogriff, I'd imagine. And I shouldn't have been surprised he's your brother, given how stupid the rumors say he is." Dismissed. Hagrid was a very strong man. He couldn't avoid being strong given his half-giant stature. However, 5 stunning spells hitting him simultaneously could even do him in. Umbridge nodded. "Smart move. If you were to attack one of the Aurors, you'd be going to Azkaban. Now get the hell out of my sight, half-breed." Hagrid could only fume helplessly as the Aurors picked him up with difficulty and started carrying him back to his former office. En route, he passed through the great hall, where a disheveled Trelawney was pleading with a stunned McGonagall. A whole gaggle of students surrounded the former divination teacher, staring at both her and McGonagall in horror. Hagrid couldn't believe what had happened. What was he going to do now? He doubted the Ministry of Magic would give him a job given the fact that bigots were in charge. Most of the giants had sided with Voldemort, so he couldn't go back home. He couldn't live in the Muggle world, either. He'd stand out too much and would likely scare Muggles. Suddenly, something came to him. Shaking his huge head to clear it and getting lots of wands pointed at him for his trouble, he asked if he could go to Dumbledore's office one last time. There was something he needed to check out. One of the Aurors shook his head. "Dumbledore isn't here, Mr. Hagrid. I'm sorry. To be perfectly honest, we don't think you've done anything to deserve a dismissal, but orders are orders." Hagrid shook his head. "I don't need to talk to Dumbledore. There's something which may be of use to me up there." The Auror considered it for a second. "Will you give me your word of honor that you will not try to escape custody?" Hagrid swallowed. "I will. I know the password. Let me in there." Dubiously, the Aurors followed him into Dumbledore's tower. The tower was unoccupied. The little machines were still whirring on the headmaster's desk, and the computer monitor seemed to be showing a document involving spell components. Hagrid looked frantically around the room. Where was it? It had to be here somewhere. He prayed Dumbledore hadn't thrown it out. He wished he had a wand so he could summon the object. Eventually, though, he found it. It was a little card sitting on a shelf. At the time, it hadn't seemed important. Now, however, everything had changed. He looked down at the card. It had everything on it that he needed. Dr. Robert J. Roachfish and Wildlife, Service United States of Americana Tabug at FWS. Gov 202-555-1212. He looked at the computer on Dumbledore's desk. Slowly, he turned to the Aurors. "Any of you know how to use a computer?" From Albus at Hogwarts. Octa. Inattabug at FWS. Gov subject. Haggard half-giant ganged Mindir Surthais Geese. Hagrid Oi talked to you earlier. Your Pradent asked me about Zoo Jobai. Changed my mind. And won't art go to the usual send. Taiwan Owl F equals, so you can talk to Messin Sorella Rubius Hagrid. P.S. Is it okay if I bring my bother his name Il Grop, and he's very friendly, want her to foy. Chapter 79, Wizard Protection Act. March 8, 1996, Oval Office, White House, Washington. DQ United States of America text of the President's speech to the nation. My fellow Americans, a little over a week ago, a terrible tragedy took place. A hate group called America for Humans, based in Westboro, Kansas, brutally assaulted an innocent woman. They beat her savagely, dragged her through the snow to a park, tied her to a tree, and tried to set her on fire. Had it not been for the timely intervention of the local authorities, she would have likely been killed. She was attacked because America for Humans thought she was a witch. As a matter of fact, she was not a witch. She was just an ordinary, non-magical human being like you and me, often referred to as a muggle. She just happened to have been in the area when a car swerved out of control and injured someone she had been arguing with. America for Humans thought that she had ensorcelled the car, and things deteriorated from there. I must confess that I am quite disappointed. I had thought that America had outgrown the rancor and superstition which had triggered the Salem witch trials. For those of you who are unaware, a minor breach of the statute of secrecy in Salem, Massachusetts frightened the Puritans and started a witch hunt. Several people were accused as witches and executed after show trials virtually guaranteed to the convict, the defendant. Some of you may have seen the ghost of one of these witches on the Four Towns video. Yes, Rebecca Nurse, Goody Nurse, as she refers to herself, was one of the women executed during this ordeal. The vast majority of the victims were in fact not witches. Although a few witches were in fact picked up, they were in fact in the minority. Furthermore, the Puritans would have been horrified to learn that the witches would have in fact been able to escape from their nooses using magic. Had they done so, the only people who would have lost their lives would have been people who would have been wrongfully accused. As it is, these brave witches decided to sacrifice themselves to prevent the knowledge of the wizarding world to spread any further. The wizards are among us. You know it. I know it. I have met several of these individuals and am convinced that they want to live out their lives in peace, just like we do. It is not their fault that they have magical abilities. They can turn off their wizarding powers about as easily as someone can turn off blue eyes. Please don't discriminate against the wizards for something like this. I call upon the House and Senate to start work on and bill the Civil Rights Act of 1996, which will outlaw discrimination against people on the basis of magical ability. This is still a first contact situation for the most part, and we need to make sure that relations between these two groups of people are as smooth as possible. I spoke with Secretary Radner about this, and although he said he could in theory use magic to force the bill through Congress, he refused to do so because it would be inappropriate and that the Muggle government is outside his jurisdiction. He also said that sending things through Congress, without first consulting, the will of the people would set an extremely bad precedent. I call upon the House and Senate to have this bill in place by the end of 1997. It is about time that our country started doing something about its history of discrimination. If I am still your president at the end of 1997, I will do everything possible to ensure its rapid ratification. If you so choose to go in a different direction in the November election, rest assured that Senator Dole also agrees that legislation is necessary to protect our most unique citizens. Until the time that this bill passes, the federal government will be establishing a program designed to protect the wizards and their communities from the attacks of hate groups such as America for Humans. Although Secretary Radner has told me that the wizards will be more than able to defend themselves in case of an attack now that the statute of secrecy is gone, he is requesting that the federal government handle the protection duties simply because the repercussions of a magical attack on American citizens, even in self-defense, would be problematic, to say the least, and open to misinterpretation. As a result, the following precautions will be put in place to ensure that wizarding communities are allowed to practice their traditions in safety. These will all take effect on April 1st, 1996. 1. Motorized fishing boats will not be permitted onto the Quabbin Reservoir in central Massachusetts. That is the home to the Wizarding Capital District. Kayaking and canoeing will still be permitted in small boats and in small boats only. 2. The following areas will be made off limits to American Muggles without express permission from a wizarding authority. A. The summit of Mt. St. Helens. B. The center of the Ocala National Forest. C. Big Thicket National Preserve, which will be closed on April 1st. D. A remote section of Smoky Mountain National Park. E. Everything within half a mile radius of Mt. Rushmore. F. The Yucca Mountain Waste Dump, Ange. The American Eagle's Gold Mine in Colorado. In addition, the MIT dormitory known as MacGregor House will be forbidden to all non-students and staff at the beginning of the 1996-1997 school year. For a complete list of the affected areas, contact your local congressman or congresswoman. 3. A $500 reward will be issued to anyone who reports an act of discrimination on the grounds of magical ability. The reward will only be given if the case results in a conviction. 4. All houses of worship will be provided with security guards. America for Humans has already threatened to attack some of our most cherished institutions and have accused great religious figures of witchcraft. Whenever possible, the guards will be of the faith of the congregation they are protecting. We in the government apologize for the inconvenience. However, it is important that our relationship with wizards get off on the right foot. What we do now will set a precedent for generations to come. Thank you for your attention. Chapter 80. Very Alternative Medicine. March 11, 1996, Harvard Pilgrim Health, Boston. United States of America. The nurse stepped out into the waiting room and called out a name. Charles Nelson. Finally, Charles thought. He'd been sitting around in this waiting room reading old issues of Sports Illustrated for 30 minutes already. Not only had that article about the Celtics been boring, reading it had done nothing to alleviate his headache. He figured it was allergies, but he wanted to be sure. If he was lucky, they'd prescribe him something to make the pain go away. He got up and let the nurse follow him into an examination. They took his vital signs and then left the room so he could get into the hospital gown. The blood pressure seemed normal. For the first time in a while, he hadn't recorded a high blood pressure due to the infamous white coat syndrome. 15 minutes later, the doctor hadn't come in. Charles frowned. He knew the healthcare system was screwed up, but he didn't think he'd have to wait this long. To top that off, the headache was getting worse. Maybe it's stress, he thought. If all else failed, he'd get on some antidepressant or something like that. He'd better get something for all of this waiting. After a couple of more minutes, there was a commotion outside his room. It sounded like a large number of people, at least 5, were talking quietly and urgently outside. What was this all about? Was he sicker than he had thought? Were they going to tell him it was a brain tumor or something like that? Was he on the brink of death? Be realistic, he told himself. They haven't examined you yet. How could they have determined he was about to die simply by weighing him? So he was a bit overweight. Big deal. Everyone was now. Then the door opened and the doctor came in, followed by a man Charles had never seen before. The man was wearing a doctor's lab coat over a bizarre purple robe. Charles started at him. What hell was he? Some kind of trainee? The doctor shook his hand. Good afternoon, Charles. I'm Dr. Marks. I'll look you over momentarily. However, I was wondering if you would be willing to participate in a news conference about a new medical initiative involving the wizarding community. Charles stared at him. A news conference? What do you mean? The doctor indicated the robed man. This is Secretary of Magic Travis Radner. He has come to announce the new initiative. Would you be willing to be part of the announcement? You don't have to do anything. If you wish, you can have the secretary examine you. Charles stared at the wizard. You're going to have this witch cast a spell on me and tell me what's wrong. Radner shook his head and smiled. Wizard, Mr. Nelson. A witch is a female wizard, and I am most assuredly not female. However, in all fairness, I wouldn't be the one doing the examination. I am not a trained healer. All examinations would be conducted by trained wizarding healers. You will be in safe hands. Charles shook his head. I'm a bit nervous about wizarding medicine at this point, Secretary Radner. I'll help with the announcement if you need a patient, but I'd prefer focusing on traditional medicine for the time being. No offense, sir. Radner nodded in understanding. I understand, Mr. Nelson. Magical remedies and cures, while effective, are still considered a bit alternative when it comes to Muggles. However, if that is your wish, I'll respect it. Now, I'll withdraw while the doctor examines you. The doctor will summon us when the session is done. With that, Secretary Radner shook hands all around and left the room. The doctor spent the next 10 minutes examining him and determining that he'd been suffering from stress headaches. He recommended relaxation and counseling. When Charles said that he was wondering if the doctor could prescribe medicine, the doctor explained that, although he was willing to do so, it would be better for the patient in the long run to make lifestyle and attitude changes which would allow him to be more tolerant of stress. Life was stressful, for good or for ill. It would be better to spend some time learning this new skill than falling for a quick fix. Charles agreed with the doctor and jotted down several phone numbers and email addresses for therapists, as well as for sanctuaries such as the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center. Charles hadn't tried meditation before and was still a bit skeptical of it, but he figured it was at least worth a shot. When everything had been decided, the doctor excused himself and left the room to tell Radner everything was ready. Seconds later, he and Radner returned, with 5 other people. 2 of them were holding lighting equipment. One of them was holding a microphone. One was holding something which appeared to be a television camera. The 5th one, dressed in a robe similar to Radner's, appeared to be holding a gigantic photographic camera of some sort. Charles stared at it in puzzlement. The robed man nodded his head at the camera and explained, "This takes dynamic photographs, Mr. Nelson. It uses magic to create photographs with moving contents. Imagine a video camera which is able to animate the subject matter without a long exposure." Charles grunted, "Isn't that impossible?" The robed man nodded. "Using Muggle technology, yes. However, it's commonplace in the magical world. I've got a magical newspaper here if you'd like to see some more examples of these photographs." Charles stared at him. "You wizards have a special newspaper." "Several of them, Mr. Nelson. The most famous one is the Daily Prophet, based in London. The local newspaper is called Greenwich Magical Journal. It's published in Greenwich, one of the 4 towns. The GMJ staff is actually debating allowing Muggles to subscribe so they can learn more about the wizarding world. If you want, I can subscribe you to it." Charles shook his head. "No thanks. I've already got enough problems without having to worry about giants and vampires taking over the world." Radner grinned. "There aren't that many vampires, and the giants stay away from humans for the most part. Rest assured you have nothing to worry about. However, I understand your concern. Now, if you're ready, we'll begin the announcement." Charles looked at the doctor and then back at Radner. "Fine with me." Radner smiled, ran his hand through his hair, and turned to face the phalanx of video cameras. The main Muggle cameraman counted down from 3 and then pointed at Radner. He was on the air. Radner looked into the camera and began speaking. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Secretary of Magic Travis Radner speaking from one of the internal medicine wings of the Harvard Pilgrim Health Building in Boston, Massachusetts. I've come to this hospital to announce a new initiative which will be made available to all Muggles starting July 1st. This initiative involves assigning various wizarding healers to hospitals all over the country as practitioners of, for the lack of a better word, alternative therapies. All health plans which permit alternative therapies will be required to permit magical healers as well. We are still working out the final distribution of the wizards through the country's hospitals. However, I can already tell you that there will be at least one wizard-augmented hospital within 20 miles of 98% of the United States population. The remaining 2% of the people will be able to receive free house calls from wizard healers at no additional charge. Wizard healers can do things typical Muggle doctors cannot do. They are able to deal with diseases like AIDS and migraines. However, they have limitations as well. First and foremost, they cannot reverse aging or death. Second, wizarding surgery is a bit primitive, and they themselves recommend that they use our practices. If you do choose to have a wizard accompany surgery, you will likely undergo an ordinary Muggle operation, where the wizard will be of assistance, stemming bleeding, and dealing with simple complications. The secretary turned to look at Charles, who blinked as the cameras all turned to look at him. Keep in mind that wizard support is entirely optional, Some people may prefer to trust in Muggle doctors. That may very well likely be the case in the beginning, and it appears to have been the case in most of the people I've spoken to so far, including this patient here. I envision a day where the medical expertise of the wizarding and Muggle worlds will be able to join forces to make health care a cheaper and more effective reality for both parties. He then motioned the Muggle doctor over to Charles's examination table and told all three of them to smile. A bemused Charles smiled for the photo op as the robed figure with the camera pointed it at the group. There was a big flash, and a thick cloud of colored smoke poured into the air from the camera. The doctor suddenly gasped and told the man with the camera to leave the room, as smoke could just make sick people worse, and many of the people in the wing had conditions more serious than a stress headache. Radner had barely gotten through explaining that the smoke was harmless to humans when it reached the ceiling and naturally triggered the fire alarm. Sprinklers started spraying all over the room, and alarms started hooting. It took a good 5 minutes or so for officials to restore order in the hospital. Radner swore, "Damn, I forgot about the damn smoke alarms. I thought I knew a lot about Muggles. Well, there's even stuff I don't know how to handle yet. Note to self, don't bring our cameras into Muggle buildings with fire alarms." Irritated, Radner waved his wand, and the alarms all shut off. Amplifying his voice, he announced that everything was all right and that it had been a false alarm. None of the patients were in danger, and everyone could re-enter the building. Charles didn't know whether the other occupants would believe him, but it was better than nothing. Inevitably, the fire department had to come and sort out all the mess. However, before they were forced to evacuate the wing, Charles managed to get a quick glance at a piece of paper which had fallen out of the strange camera. It showed video, an honest-to-goodness video of him, the doctor, and Radner smiling at the camera. As he watched, the doctor on the film gasped and started racing towards the camera, waving his hands feverishly. There's a shot that went awry, he thought. Chapter 81, The Muslim Kohen Gadol. March 14, 1996, Al-Aqsa Mosque, Jerusalem. The head imam looked out over the congregation. Everything seemed to be going the way it was supposed to. No one had brought their shoes in, at least to the men's section, and for the time being the screams of the children was being kept to a minimum. There were a few tourists here and there, but most of them had left when he had told them that it was time for services. If they felt like praying, then by all means they could stay. However, if they weren't in the mood for services, they should come back at a more appropriate time. It had been less than a month since Samuel the prophet had shown up at that Allah-forsaken ghost convention. Although Samuel hadn't intended to ignite a controversy among the three Abrahamic religions, ignite one he had. The idea that all Judaism, Islam, and Christianity were functionally equivalent in Samuel's eyes was hard to swallow. The Imam had enough trouble reconciling Shia and Sunni Islam. Now he had to bring the other two faiths in there as well. If there was ever a time for the Mahdi to arrive and clear things up, it would be now. Then again, there wasn't much he could do about it for the time being, so he tried to keep everything more or less the way it was. He figured that if Allah in his great wisdom had allowed Islam to maintain control of the Temple Mount, he was at the very least satisfied with what he, the Imam, was doing. There were, of course, a few hotheads among the other two monotheistic traditions who tended to disagree with him. He kept on hearing rumors of Jewish and Christian fundamentalists who were trying to blow up his mosque, arguing that a neutral place of worship needed to be constructed which did not favor any one of the three faiths. He doubted that Allah would allow fundamentalists of any sort to destroy a holy shrine such as this, but he couldn't prevent himself from being a wee bit nervous. He had asked the mayor of Jerusalem to provide extra security around the mosque, a request that the mayor had granted immediately. Unfortunately, he couldn't help but think of the possibility that a bomber or fundamentalist would happen to sneak his way into the security forces. Quiet footsteps behind him interrupted his train of thought. He turned and saw one of his staff members looking at him with a panicked expression on his face. What had happened now? Did one of the women accidentally walk into the men's section again? Lowering his voice as to not disturb the worshippers, he asked the newcomer what was going on. The response was short and sweet. "Imam, Samuel is here. He wants to talk to you." The Imam frowned. "Samuel, Samuel who? I don't recall having an appointment." The messenger bit his lip. "It's Samuel, period. The prophet. He just showed up here with his interpreter and wants to talk to whoever's in charge here." The Imam blanched. "Allah protect me," he thought. "What am I supposed to do now? How am I supposed to win an argument with a legendary historical figure?" Granted, Samuel didn't seem at all like what the Old Testament made him out to be. He had proven to be a short, ascetic bald man with a small mustache and short beard. He didn't look like someone who could call upon Allah to strike his foes with lightning. Then again, the prophet himself had been an ordinary person before the archangel spoke to him. No one would have been able to pick Mohammed up in a lineup before that. He sighed and nodded. "I'll be in my office. Let him in and join me. No offense, young man, but I'm a bit nervous talking to him." The messenger put his hand on the Imam's shoulder. "Sir, I understand. If there's anything I can do to help, I will." With that, the messenger walked off, and the Imam headed over to his office. He looked around at all the religious tomes and books for spiritual guidance. He doubted that any of them actually considered the possibility that one of the great figures of history would show up 3,000 years later to talk to him. The door opened, and the messenger led Samuel and the interpreter into the room. Samuel was dressed in his usual ancient-looking clothing. The interpreter had dressed in modest clothing and a robe, as was appropriate for his role and for the fact that he would be entering a mosque. Samuel looked at him and barked something at him. The Imam couldn't tell what language it was, though it sounded vaguely related to Arabic. He should have known, he thought. Arabic has changed a great deal since the time of the Quran, and this man was from 1600 years before that. The interpreter's eyebrows shot up, but he translated. "Samuel bids you greetings," and was wondering if he could speak to the high priest. The Imam looked at his colleague, confused. "High priest? What does he mean, high priest?" The interpreter responded in modern Arabic. Judging by Samuel's reaction, the biblical figure had no idea what the interpreter was saying. "I think he's confused, Imam. He thinks that this is the temple from the Old Testament, which was led by the high priest. Granted, there was no temple in his time, but this is the most sacred site in Jerusalem, so it would be the most obvious place to put one." The Imam stared at him. "I'm not the high priest. There hasn't been a high priest here for millennia." The interpreter thought a moment. "You may not be the high priest. However, to be frank, you're the closet thing to a high priest right now in Islam. Perhaps Allah intends you to be the new high priest. Think about it, Imam. You're in charge of the direct successor to the Jewish temple. That would make you the acting high priest, in a sense. But this site is not the holiest site in the faith. Mecca is." "I'm aware of that, Imam." Samuel probably isn't, however, and he would likely be shocked to hear that a site outside the Holy Land is going to be considered more important than the Temple Mount. "As far as Samuel is concerned, you're the high priest, and I think you're going to wind up stuck with the role." The Imam didn't like this. Unfortunately, he didn't seem like he had much of a choice. Bracing himself for the inevitable explosion, he told the interpreter to tell Samuel that he was the highest-ranking clergyman in the mosque. In response, Samuel tried to shake his hand and looked on in irritation as his hand passed right through the Imam's. He then spoke once again, and the interpreter translated. "Good afternoon, High Priest. Congratulations on your appointment." The Imam couldn't lie to a man like this, he thought. He couldn't, so he told the truth. "I'm sorry, revered one, but I'm not the high priest. There hasn't been a high priest in this shrine for thousands of years." Samuel stared at him. Very strange. However, it's understandable how traditions can be corrupted over thousands of years. At any rate, I'm going to be making some changes to unify these various monotheistic sects into one coherent faith, just like God wanted. Would you be willing to act as high priest until we're able to figure out who the highest-ranking priest is? The imam stared at him. If he said no, he'd probably get kicked out by whoever Samuel installed as the new high priest. Oh well, he thought. Allah worked in mysterious ways. He hoped he knew what he was getting into. The imam took a deep breath and nodded. I'll do it, revered one. Samuel looked pleased. Good. I was hoping that you can make an announcement which ensures that all three monotheistic sects, you call them Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, to worship here at the temple. The imam stared at his colleague, only to see his friend's jaw drop. What the hell was he supposed to say now? It would be blasphemy to have the other two faiths here. It was time for some fast talking here. He turned to Samuel and explained. Revered one, Christianity and Judaism are older versions of the faith. Their beliefs don't recognize the existence of several prophets who preached after the movements split off. Samuel frowned. They aren't using the words of all the prophets. They're ignoring a few of them. Yes, revered one. Who aren't they using? The Jews don't use Jesus and Mohammed. Christians don't use Mohammed. Samuel looked at him, puzzled. I don't think I recognize either of those names. I understand, revered one. You see, both of those men preached after your time. They helped clarify several of the customs. Samuel started pacing through the desk, disturbed. This is troubling. Are you saying that we have three groups of people who follow God's word, but can't agree over how exactly it is to be interpreted? That's it, revered one. Samuel muttered something which the interpreter didn't translate, but judging from his tone of voice, it was something which would probably have been transliterated as a bunch of asterisks, ampersands, and percent signs. He then spoke once again, and the interpreter resumed his translation. Have we ascertained that both Mohammed and Jesus were indeed valid prophets? The imam nodded. Yes, revered one. Samuel groaned. This leaves me in a difficult position. It is clear that of the three faiths, Islam seems to the one God wants. That's probably why he lets you guys use the Temple Mount. Unfortunately, the other two faiths will tend to disagree with this ruling. Please don't tell me the three of you fight from time to time. The imam looked down in shame. I'm afraid we do, revered one. Samuel looked at him sternly. We've got to stop that right now. Here's what I want you to do. Tell all three sects that they're allowed to worship at the temple. However, we'll encourage them to use Islamic customs, or at least we'll introduce them to Islamic customs. Do you think you can do that? The imam hesitated. This was going to spark a big fight. He just knew it. Drawing a deep breath, he said, Revered one, they're not going to want to change their customs, and unless I'm mistaken, we can't force them because they're also monotheists. Samuel nodded. Correct, we cannot. However, we can tell them that Islam is closest to what God wants. Meanwhile, I'll go over the words of Jesus and Mohammed and see if we can adapt these teachings for the modern era. The imam looked at him in surprise. If the teachings were adapted, would this still be Islam? Samuel was digging himself in deep. He hoped that the prophet knew what he was doing. Aloud, I'll bring you and the interpreter a copy of the Quran, Mohammed's holy book. I'll also make sure you get a copy of the New Testament, which records much of Jesus' work. Samuel nodded. That would be most appreciated. I want to get everyone started unifying the three religions by the time next month comes around. The imam stared at Samuel. Next month? What happens next month? Samuel grinned. Passover, of course. I'll see you next month. Hopefully you'll be able to fit a lot of pilgrims in here. Now, if you would excuse me, we have to go. Have a good afternoon. With that, Samuel disappeared, and the interpreter left the room. This left the imam and his friend staring at each other in disbelief. Finally, the friend broke the silence. What in Allah's name do we do now? Chapter 82. Lucius in Saudi Arabia. March 15, 1996. Main Audience Chamber. Royal Palace, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Lucius Malfoy sat in the audience chamber, thinking whether he had done the right thing. The Dark Lord had issued a call to all the Death Eaters, asking them to arrive at the graveyard where he had been revived the previous year. Lucius, who fancied himself one of Voldemort's most loyal servants, yearned to join them. He hadn't seen many of his Death Eater colleagues for a long time, and had looked forward to catching up with a few new faces. Granted, he wouldn't have been able to see everyone. Karkaroff was in hiding, Snape was at Hogwarts, Pettigrew was locked in Snape's house, and Rodolphus Lestrange was out talking with someone in North Korea. But he'd have gotten a chance to see most of him. Unfortunately, the Dark Lord had given him orders, just like Rodolphus Lestrange. His orders were to leave England and visit a foreign dignitary to see if they needed any help dealing with perceived threats to their regimes. Hopefully, this would allow Voldemort to insert Death Eaters into the government, placing them in a position to take control of Muggle countries. Voldemort figured judicious use of magic would make it easy for him to impress Muggles and manipulate world governments. Considering, good, wizards' reluctance to use unforgivable curses and other strong spells, Lucius gave the Death Eaters a good chance of success. Lucius's task was to speak with King Fahd, the leader of Saudi Arabia. He had never been to the Middle East before and had been forced to read up on some of the local customs from a Muggle book he'd managed to unobtrusively geminio from a library. Fortunately, as a distant member of the British wizarding nobility, he was more than familiar with etiquette and protocol in royal circles. He hoped that this experience would come in handy here. He suspected that Fahd knew very little about the wizarding world. He probably had no knowledge of Dark Lord's prior attempt at power in Britain, and even if he did, he'd have probably passed Voldemort off as a regional threat to the United Kingdom. In all likelihood, he and any wizards in his kingdom didn't even know what a Death Eater was. The fact that Minister Fudge had refused to acknowledge Voldemort's existence worked to his advantage in this case. He looked up as the secretary entered the room. "Wizard Malfoy, the king is ready to see you now. Please follow me." Lucius bowed respectfully. "As you wish, sir, lead on." The secretary nodded and led him through the palace. Lucius, figuring this would be a good time for some investigation as to Saudi Arabia's wizarding defenses, struck a conversation with the secretary. "Have you, or His Majesty, seen any other wizards before?" The secretary nodded. "Allah be praised, we have. You see, His Majesty had a stroke at the beginning of the year and was on death's door. We were about to euthanize him when Haydar Dagher, our Minister of Magic, came in and told us that he would be able to save the king with magic." Interesting, Lucius thought. These guys had a ministry of magic. He needed to learn more about them and figure out how powerful they were. They couldn't be that open given what he knew about Islam. Aloud, he said, "I take it Wizard Dagher saved the king's life. I heard he'd had a miraculous recovery, but didn't know wizards had saved him." The secretary nodded. "Indeed, a wizarding healer saved his life. It was touch and go there. The imam who had been in attendance to perform last rites was offended when Dagher recommended magical cures. Fortunately, Crown Prince Abdullah told the imam that he'd be with Allah in 5 minutes if he didn't change his mind. Not surprisingly, he did." Lucius whistled. Praise Allah for the end of the statute of secrecy. In the old days, His Majesty would have likely fallen. Now, thankfully, things will be different. Is your ministry well organized? The secretary shook his head. "I don't know, Wizard Malfoy. No one seems to know much about them, including the king. The religious community would be in an uproar, as you would suspect, if they came out too much in the open. If you wish, you can ask His Majesty to summon Wizard Dagher so you can talk to him." Lucius hesitated. If anyone was to know about Death Eaters, it would be the Minister of Magic. The minister could recognize his name, and very likely ask him to pull back his robe in the presence of the king to force him to reveal his Death Eater tattoo. He couldn't refuse a request in the king's presence, and the presence of the tattoo would give the game away immediately. He'd better be cautious. Aloud, "Thank you for your assistance. I'd be intrigued, I must admit. However, I don't want to pry into state secrets, and as a result, I don't think it would be appropriate for me to get involved." The secretary nodded. "As you wish, Wizard Malfoy." With that, the secretary led Lucius into the audience chamber and introduced him. Lucius prostrated himself on the ground, as was the custom in these parts. The king then bid him rise and shook his hand. "Welcome to Riyadh, Wizard Malfoy. Is there anything I can do to make you more comfortable? Fruit juice, water?" Lucius thought for a moment. "I wouldn't mind some wine, but from what I understand, wine is forbidden to Muslims, and I don't want to offend anyone." The king nodded. "You are correct, Wizard Malfoy. We don't serve wine at audiences like this for precisely this reason." Lucius grinned. "I see my knowledge about your culture is accurate. We wizards have had to catch up in a hurry, so I'll have pomegranate juice instead." The king snapped his fingers, and the secretary bowed and raced off to get the drink. Alone with the king, Lucius cast his line. "Your Majesty, I have come here to offer the assistance of me and my allies in Britain in combating wizards who may be joining Al-Qaeda." Fard stared at him. "How did you know we needed help?" Osama bin Laden's tape to the west. He mentioned that he was recruiting jihadist wizards. You don't want evil sorcerers in Saudi Arabia, and we don't want Al-Qaeda casting unforgivable curses against our assets either. The enemy of our enemy is our friend, and I come here in the hand of friendship. Fard looked at him thoughtfully. "Are your allies going to be powerful enough to take out a wizard's enhanced Al-Qaeda? I know the Muggle authorities, including my own government, haven't had much success." Lucius grinned. "Your Majesty, my group is headed by the man who may be the most powerful wizard ever to walk the face of the earth. All of his enemies tremble before him, and very few dare speak his name." Fard stroked his beard. "That's an impressive group, I must say. Are you involved with the British Ministry of Magic? I figure Britain has a Ministry of Magic similar to ours." Lucius didn't even have to lie about this. "Yes, Your Majesty, I work for the British Ministry of Magic." Fard thought for a moment. Lucius waited expectantly. He had him. He knew it. He was surprised, however, when Fard shook his head. "I've given it some thought, Wizard Malfoy. Right now, we've got a plan in place to deal with the possibility that Al-Qaeda manages to pick up a few wizards. Our Ministry of Magic will be taking care of it. If our Ministry of Magic is as powerful as yours, I think we'll be able to take care of it ourselves." Lucius bit back an oath while maintaining his prim and proper face. "Are you sure? I don't want to see you overthrown just because a terrorist group picked up a wizard." Fard's eyes narrowed at him. "And I don't want to become indebted to someone who wants to try to force a reduced price for oil either." Lucius's mind raced as he tried to understand the reference. Eventually, though, he succeeded. "I understand, Your Majesty, and I will respect your decision. However, don't hesitate to call upon us if you need any advice in the future." The king nodded as the secretary came in with the pomegranate juice. "I'll take that under advisement. In the meantime, let's have some pomegranate juice and exchange stories of our vastly separate worlds." Thousands of miles away, Severus Snape thought about the report he'd just heard from Lord Voldemort. It seemed as if almost everyone was going to be attending the meeting. The only people missing would be Lucius, Wormtail, Rodolphus, and Karkaroff. It would have been helpful to take out Lucius, but this was too good an opportunity to pass up. He'd played double agent long enough. It was about time he showed Voldemort his true colors. It was about time the Dark Lord was punished for his murder of Lily Evans. He fumbled around in his pocket for a Muggle coin and inserted it into the payphone. He dialed the number written on the small piece of parchment in front of him. The phone rang 3 times, and someone picked up. "This is Emerald City." Snape spoke precisely into the phone. "Emerald City, this is Scarecrow. I regret that I must report that a tornado warning is in effect until 7:30 p.m. tonight. It's where we expected in Kansas." The voice on the other end of the line understood immediately. "Acknowledged. 7:30 p.m. in Kansas. Make sure to get out of the way before houses start flying around." Snape nodded. "I will, Scarecrow out." Chapter 83. A Familiar Name. March 15, 1996, 1545 Zeeth, Borough, Great Britain. J.K. Rowling looked in amazement at the oddly shaped house in front of her. Its lines seemed a bit strange, and there wasn't a driveway leading into it, or even a road, for that matter. She had realized quickly, however, that the people who lived here wouldn't be in need of roads or driveways. It reminded her of one of her old dreams, a long time ago. Back in the early 90s, well before the Super Bowl breach, she had dreamed up a fantasy world featuring a teenage wizard. She had fleshed this world out to the point where she believed that someday she might be able to write a novel about this teenager's experiences. However, that was not to be. A bad case of writer's block midway through the project slowed and then eventually stalled it. Her dreams eventually fell apart completely when all of the publishers turned down samples from a short novel describing the wizard's world. She had thought it was the end of the world when she realized that she would never become an author. Fortunately, every cloud had a silver lining. In this case, the lining happened to be a connection one of the publishers had with the Daily Mail. Although the publisher had believed that her book about the teenage wizard wouldn't sell, he realized that she was a good author. Knowing that a single mother had to have a decent job in order to raise her children in this economy, he sent her writing sample off to the Mail to see if she would be able to sign up as a columnist or reporter. His connections paid off, and 6 months later, she had taken a job writing for one of the most important newspapers in Britain. Her first article about a celebrity polo match hadn't been anywhere near the front page. However, it had received good reviews from the few people who had read. She then graduated to stories about the royal family and opinion pieces. Eventually, an article about the Canary Wharf terrorist attack made the front page and catapulted her onto the national stage. It was then that she learned about the wizarding community. Remembering her failed book about the teenage wizard, she had asked her boss for permission to be the newspaper's point person for interviewing the wizards. Her supervisor, recognizing her talent and knowing that the other newspapers would be sending good reporters to compete for wizarding news, agreed. So far, everything had gone according to plan. The only fly in the ointment had been the fact that combining her traditional duties with those on the rapidly developing wizarding front were forcing her to work 60 to 70 hours per week. Add to that the time that she had to spend raising her family, and she could barely keep herself afloat. Less than a week ago, news had leaked out that Harry Potter, the boy who had triggered the Super Bowl breach, had finally decided to give an interview to the Muggle world. This immediately led to a frenzy where no fewer than 70 newspapers vied for access to the accidental celebrity. Inevitably, Cornelius Fudge, who still controlled access to Harry, thanks to the young wizard's house arrest, decreed that one reporter's name be drawn from a hat. As it turned out, she had been the lucky winner. J.K. Rowling wondered if there was some kind of magical connection linking her and the young hooligan. The interview had been scheduled for 4:00 p.m. today. She had spoken with Ministry of Magic officials, and they had given her a charm which would allow her access to the borough. As far as they knew, she would be the first Muggle woman to actually visit a wizarding residence without having had any prior ties to the wizarding world. She had arched her eyebrows when they mentioned the word woman. When she pressed the official for details, they admitted that a Muggle man had visited Hogwarts a few weeks earlier on classified business. She was not going to be alone in her interview of Potter. Apparently, the wizarding world had their own newspapers, and one of their reporters, an attractive blonde woman named Rita Skeeter, had also been selected to speak with the boy. J.K. Rowling was intrigued by the witch. However, there was something about her which made her a little uneasy. The fact that she wrote on parchment, had a quill which moved of its own volition, and was dressed in garish clothing probably contributed to her discomfort. The police of both worlds were out in force for this event. She didn't know how they'd gotten here, but gotten here they had. Muggle cops were doing their best to keep back the hundreds of reporters whose names had not been drawn. Scattered among the cops were oddly dressed men with what must have been magic wands. Ministry officials had told her that wizarding law enforcement officers, known as auras, would be helping with crowd control, and that they would only use magic in absolute self-defense. Both sides were nervous about the repercussions of an aura being let loose on a mob of confused muggles. A man approached her and Miss Skeeter with 5 minutes to go. "Ladies, listen to me. Here's how it's going to work. It's now about 3:55. The interview will start promptly at 4:00 and last 1 hour. You can ask whatever questions you wish. I have told Mr. Potter that he can say whatever he wants. However, be advised that any newspaper columns must be run by the Minister of Magic for approval. That includes you, Miss Skeeter." Skeeter glared at him. Rowling, however, stared at him, confused. "Sir, how do I get in touch with the Ministry of Magic? Besides, I wouldn't expect that Muggles would be under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Magic. Shouldn't someone in Her Majesty's government be supervising me? At the very minimum, my boss ought to know of this." The functionary nodded. "Normally, that would be the case, Ms. Rowling. However, this is an exceptional situation. You're dealing with someone under house arrest here, and the ministry wants to make sure nothing improper makes it into the Muggle presses. Minister Fudge is especially worried about stuff that could compromise relations between the Muggles and the Wizards. Furthermore, this particular boy has been a troublemaker his entire life. The Super Bowl breach was the final straw." Both women nodded at that. The functionary then produced a parchment and a quill, asked both women to sign it, and then disappeared. 2 minutes later, Rowling's wristwatch chimed 4:00. Nodding to her colleague, the two reporters headed into the house. Rowling looked around the home and was amazed at what she found. Dishes washing themselves. Clocks which kept track of all of the children's whereabouts. So many chores being handled using magic instead of main strength. This kind of life seemed a lot easier. She made a note to ask for silverware like this women, raising a child on their own, and working 70 hours a week needed equipment like that. Skeeter, on the other hand, didn't give the magical implements anything more than a cursory glance. Looking over her shoulder with cold disdain, she told the Rowling to follow her into the living room. Rowling entered the room to find Skeeter arguing with a boy of about 15 with a round face and glasses. She had seen the Super Bowl footage and could tell pretty easily that it was the same boy. It appears that Skeeter recognized him as well, and he recognized her. Harry was pointing at the door. "Get out of here, Skeeter. I had enough trouble with you last year. There I was, fighting for my life against dragons and Lord Voldemort, and all you did was get in my face and distract me. That Hungarian horntail could have killed me." Rowling's jaw dropped as Skeeter winced. Dragons, Lord Voldemort, those sounded like nasty adversaries. The Muggle jotted down some notes. Skeeter wasn't moved. "I'm here to interview you for the Daily Prophet. Will you answer a few questions for me?" Harry folded his hands across his chest. Rowling whistled. This was a surly, strong-willed boy. "No, you already know everything about me. Bloody hell, you probably covered that damn trial I had back in August. What's more, you're going to distort everything I say so that Voldemort is erased from the record and sensationalize the rest. I want you out of here. Now." Skeeter stared at him, furious. "Young man." Harry rose to his feet. "There's the door, Skeeter. Do you want Hermione or someone like that to turn you into an insect? Get out of here, at least until I speak with the Muggle reporter." Skeeter fumed for a moment but composed herself. Fine. However, I know where you are, and I know you can't go anywhere. I'll be back. With that, she left in a huff, leaving Rowling alone with Harry. Rowling sat down next to Harry as the boy calmed down and stared at her. I'm sorry, ma'am. That reporter is a pain in the arse. I've dealt with her before. Rowling looked at the door. I can tell, Harry. She seems like a most unfriendly woman. At any rate, I'm Joe Rowling and I write for the Daily Mail. Can I ask you a few questions? Harry nodded. Go ahead. Why did you do it? Why did you violate the statute of secrecy? Harry shook his head. It was unintentional. Judging from what my friends have concluded, the disillusionment charm used to make an object invisible, in this case me, does not prevent electronic video equipment from recording images of the subject. I was caught by complete accident flying past that boat. There was no way the wizarding community could have known. Rowling wrote that down. What were you doing at the time? My family was attacked by a dementor, an evil creature which causes depression in Muggles and can force people to suffer a fate worse than death. Trust me, Ms. Rowling, you don't want to know. At any rate, we were flying away towards a wizarding safe house, where the dementors wouldn't be able to get at us as easily. Why were you attacked? Have you done something wrong? Harry shook his head once more, this time more violently. No. You see, the Dementors have defected from the Ministry's control and have sided with an evil wizard named Tom Marvolo Riddle. He often goes by the name Lord Voldemort. Rowling jotted that down. This was the Voldemort you mentioned to Rita. Yes, Miss Rowling. He is an extremely dangerous man. He killed my parents, if that tells you something. I have virtually no memories of him. He's the head of a group called the Death Eaters. The Death Eaters can be easily identified by tattoos on their arms in the shape of a skull with a snake coming out of its mouth. If a Muggle authority sees any of these men, he should contact a man named Albus Dumbledore immediately, and if time permits, then the Ministry of Magic. They should not attempt to confront Riddle by themselves. Is Mr. Riddle a threat to Muggles? Harry looked at her and nodded slowly. I believe so, Ms. Rowling. However, I would recommend that you only tell this to the Muggle authorities, not the papers. I don't want to cause a panic, and Muggles would have absolutely no defense against this madman. Rowling frowned. That would explain why she hadn't heard of him. An evil wizard attacking Muggles would be the type of thing the government would want to cover up. However, there was one wizard who had made the news in the Muggle world. Are you familiar with Sirius Black? He's also an evil wizard, from what I've known. Is he a Death Eater? Harry's eyes blazed. Sirius Black is innocent. Not only that, he's my godfather. He was framed by a Death Eater by the name of Peter Pettigrew and sent to Azkaban, the wizard's prison, for 12 years. The Ministry doesn't believe me, but it's true. Have the Muggle officers visit a man named Remus Lupin during a time other than full moon. He'll explain everything. You can take Sirius's innocence to the bank. Rowling's eyes narrowed. Full moon. What does full moon have to do with it? Harry closed his eyes. Trust me, Ms. Rowling, you don't want to know. Rowling had been about to tell Harry that he was simply trying to defend his godfather when she looked into his eyes and saw the fire there. She suddenly came up short. She could tell when someone was telling the truth. He wasn't lying here. I believe you, Harry. However, I've got a lot of questions to ask you. We'll get back to this later on if time permits. How long have you been a wizard? This is my 5th year at the Hogwarts Academy of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Were your parents wizards? Yes, both were wizards. However, like I mentioned earlier, they were both killed by Voldemort's minions when I was an infant. Who raised you then? My mother's sister, Petunia Dursley. I normally live with her and her husband Vernon when school is not in session. Rowling stared at him. Vernon Dursley, the man behind Britain for Humans. Harry looked at her, confused. Britain for Humans, what is this? It's an anti-wizard hate group. They've been having a lot of protests of late. Harry snorted. Sounds like something Uncle Vernon would do. They treated me as if I were the family dog. That whole family is bigoted. I saved their son Dudley from the dementors and got no brownie points from it. Once I get out of here, I'll see if I can exonerate Sirius and move in with him. If you were raised by Muggles, how did you find out you were a wizard? I received a letter from Hogwarts directly from the hand of an 11-foot tall half-giant. I was more than surprised, to say the least. I didn't realize I had any magical talent. She checked more questions off her list. Which world do you prefer, the Muggle world or the Wizarding world? Harry thought carefully before answering. Both worlds have their benefits, to say the least. Muggles have technology, wizards have magic. Both tend to want the same goals in life and could help each other immensely now that the statute of secrecy is gone. However, I would say that I would prefer the Wizarding world to the Muggle world, thanks to my mistreatment at the hands of the Dursleys. Is wizarding ability learned or inherited? Harry shrugged. We're not sure. I suspect it's genetic in that wizards tend to have wizard children. However, we don't know for certain, and the ability to sense magic does not necessarily mean you will make a good wizard. Could there be other people in the Muggle community who are able to wield magic and don't realize it, such as the position you were in before that giant found you? Harry nodded vigorously. Yes, one of my friends has Muggle parents and is the brightest witch of our class. I'm sure she'll go far. The interview continued for a good 45 minutes. Eventually, Harry winced and told her she had to leave. He had to confront Rita Skeeter for the remaining 15. However, he told Rowling that he appreciated speaking with her and would be more than willing to tell her the rest of his story. He grinned. It would make a good Muggle novel, at least. It was 6:30 when the announcement went over the military channels. Nigel Marcellus had suspected things were going to happen, and this cinched it. It was time to see how the SAS and Wizards do on a joint mission. Emerald City to all units. Emerald City to all units. Flying house is a go. I repeat, flying house is a go. Dorothy is prepared and the Tin Man is on station. Good luck. Chapter 84, Operation Flying House. March 15, 1996, 1850, Riverside Cemetery, Little Hangle Tongrate, Britanext Parv. A brand new character asterisk warning. Major character death. Jacob Gold looked around the graveyard. As far as he could tell, he was alone under his invisibility cloak. He wasn't, however. At least 10 other Tin Men were in the vicinity, and they were all wearing invisibility cloaks. Trying to find a camouflaged SAS man was hard in itself. Give him an invisibility cloak, and it would be well nigh impossible. All of the men were armed with sniper rifles and infrared goggles and stationed a good 500 meters away. Each rifle was centered on Tom Riddle's tomb. However, Jacob hoped that he would not have to use them. The only case he would have to use them would be if the primary attack failed. He was an expert marksman, as was everyone else in the group. However, 10 SAS men were probably cannon fodder to someone of Sirius Black's, let alone Tom Riddle's caliber. The man with the code name Wizard was among them. Although Dawlish didn't believe that Riddle had returned, he couldn't deny that a large gathering of Death Eaters was something that should be monitored. It would be up to Dawlish to call in the bomb strike. If the Death Eaters were just hanging out and discussing old times, they did not warrant destruction. However, if they were actually plotting against the state, or against all odds Riddle himself reappeared, then things would be different. Dawlish had one piece of equipment in addition to the invisibility cloak and rifle. As the leader of the group and a wizard, he had positioned himself between the rest of the SAS men and the Riddle tombstone, protected by SAS bullets by a monument to the late Muriel Erlasher. However, he would likely not be using his wizarding abilities. Instead, he was in charge of a small but powerful infrared laser beam. This beam was used to guide the bomb in. The infrared goggles served 3 purposes. Night was falling, and it would be difficult to see in the dark without them. The laser beam would be clearly visible to the soldiers, but not to the targets. Finally, the Scarecrow, aka Wizard Snape, believed that wizards hiding under spells may, just may, be visible to modern infrared detectors. A disillusioned wizard had been captured on a video camera. Perhaps that piece of equipment would help the soldiers avoid sentries. Snape had planned to arrive around 1915 to give last-minute instructions. However, he had warned the strike force that they could not guarantee that they would receive these instructions. After all, if other Death Eaters got there before him, he would have to stay under cover. Jacob settled down into his watch. He still had plenty of time to kill. All he could do now was wait. March 15, 1996, 1905, Z. Arthur Weasley stared at the machine standing in front of him. He had always wanted to learn how airplanes fly. He had figured he'd get his chance with this mission. Except that from what he had been told about airplanes, this wasn't an airplane. The machine was made of metal. It seemed to consist of a small room with a few seats in it. There were two objects which looked like propellers attached to the room. There was a large propeller attached to the room's ceiling, and there was a smaller propeller attached to the back. The pilot grinned and nodded at him. "It's called a helicopter. Ever heard of those?" Arthur shook his head. "I heard of airplanes, but I haven't heard of these things. Are they a type of airplane?" "Yes, though they don't work like ordinary airplanes. The big propeller on top spins and lifts the helicopter off the ground. The one on the back helps stabilize the craft." Arthur grinned. "I can do that with magic. You don't need the propellers, sir." The pilot shook his head. "Wizard Weasley, please don't use magic here. We know magic tends to wreck electronic equipment. If you break this thing, we're going to be falling from a high altitude and won't live to tell about it." Arthur nodded. "Fair enough, lead the way." "Thank you. Here, put these on. It's going to be loud." With that, the pilot held out a pair of ear mufflers. Arthur put them over his ears and climbed into the room with a bunch of other people. The passengers closed the door, giving Arthur a chance to look around. He didn't think he'd seen this many gears, dials, and buttons in his entire life. He longed to take a photograph of the contraption, but couldn't due to the inability to use magic. It was a hell of a lot more complicated than getting a simple car to fly with magic. The pilot went through a checklist, nodded, and pushed some buttons. The propellers above started spinning. It was loud, and the blades eventually began moving so fast that they became a blur. Slowly but surely, the fantastic vehicle made its way off the ground. The pilot pushed another button and spoke into what appeared to be something attached to his helmet. "Emerald City, this is Lion. We've just found the yellow brick road and are starting to follow it." March 15, 1996, 1908 Z. The engines flared, and the Tornado aircraft started zooming down the runway of the airbase. Soon, it was airborne and headed in the general vicinity of Little Hangleton. The flight path had it veering off somewhere to the west of the target and over the Atlantic, where it would wait in a holding pattern. If the call came to fire the weapon, the aircraft would head in, low to the ground, and drop the bomb once it got close enough to the target to sense the infrared targeting beam. The bomb, aka the flying house, was a pretty powerful one. It should knock out virtually everything within a 50-meter radius. The pilot had been reluctant to drop it on a cemetery. However, once he had been briefed on the nature of the targets, he changed his mind in a hurry. By 1923, he was in position. Everything was all set. All he needed was the targeting information and the order to fire. He activated his radio communicator. "Emerald City, this is Dorothy. The tornado has been spotted in Kansas, and the house is starting to shake." March 15, 1996, 1916 Z. A flash of light announced Snape's arrival at the graveyard. His Death Eater mask was on, as usual. However, despite his reduced peripheral vision, he could tell he was not alone. Bellatrix Lestrange greeted him. "Welcome, my dear potions master." Snape dipped his head to her in acknowledgement. "Good evening, Bellatrix. How are you doing? Bellatrix smiled. I'm excited. From what I've gathered, the Dark Lord and Avery are about to announce a bold initiative which had been impossible prior to the dissolution of the Statute of Secrecy. Snape raised his eyebrows. World domination, perhaps. Bellatrix nodded. I think so. Now that we're going to be able to practice magic in the open, we're going to have fun. Snape nodded. Indeed, we will remember tonight, I suspect, for a long, long time. There was another flash. Bellatrix and Snape turned and greeted their new guest. The Death Eater mask covered his face, but they could tell who he was by his hair. Hello, Fenrir. March 15, 1996, 1930. Snape looked around the cemetery. All of the Death Eaters he knew of were there other than the four he knew would be absent. Lucius, Wormtail, Rodolphus, and Karkaroff. Nothing seemed out of place. However, he saw one thing which concerned him slightly. One of the Death Eaters had brought a faux glass. Snape looked into the faux glass, hoping that the SAS men weren't visible. They weren't. Either they were out of range, shielded from the faux glass by the invisibility cloaks, or not picked up as enemies due to the Muggle weapons. One Death Eater was still missing, the star of the show, the man who had started the entire movement. There was a final flash of light, and Lord Voldemort apparated into the clearing. Snape and all of the Death Eaters bowed to him in salute, and he smiled magnanimously. Welcome, my friends. Welcome, March 15, 1996, 1931. John Dawlish could not believe what he was seeing. Harry Potter had been right the whole time. Voldemort had returned. The Ministry was going to get into a hell of a lot of trouble for this. The man needed to be finished off right now. At the very least, he needed to be cut down before the word came out that the Ministry had refused to admit that he had returned. He stared at the serpentine face. Goodbye, Tom Marvolo Riddle. See you in hell. He pressed a button on his wristwatch and activated the infrared beam. He aimed it at the ground right behind Voldemort. He breathed a sigh of relief when none of the wizards noticed it. He doubted any of them would have even known what infrared radiation was. March 15, 1996, 1932. 12 Z deep in the bowels of the SAS headquarters, the commander-in-chief picked up the signal from Dawlish. The time had come. He took a deep breath and spoke into his communicator. All units, this is Emerald City. We have a report from the wizard. The Wicked Witch has been spotted along with all 21 flying monkeys. Dorothy, get that house in the air. I repeat, get that house in the air. March 15, 1996, 1932. 26. The fighter pilot nodded. Acknowledged. Get the house in the air. Preparing to launch. He looked at his heads-up display to see if the bomb would be able to detect the infrared beacon from Dawlish. Not yet. He'd have to come in closer. Emerald City, this is Dorothy. The tornado's getting closer and the house is shaking, but it's not off the ground yet. March 15, 1996, 1935. 21. Voldemort was explaining his plans with a big grin on his face. There you have it, my friends. This is how we're going to dominate the world. We are the only people who have the guts to use unforgivable curses, and the tactics I recommended will make us look like heroes to Muggles. Snape cheered with the rest of the Death Eaters. A quick glance at the faux glass still revealed nothing. March 15, 1996, 1935. 32. Jacob Gold stared in horror at the man with the snake-like face. Bloody hell. Riddle's alive. God help us if we don't knock him out here. He looked at his wristwatch. The backlight was yellow. This means that the fighter pilot had acknowledged the receipt of the order to fire and was closing in. March 15, 1996, 1937. 02. Bellatrix Lestrange thought she heard something in the background. She frowned and turned to Dolohov. Did you hear something? Dolohov's eyebrows shot up. Number did you? Bellatrix looked up. It sounded like an airplane. Dolohov grunted. Ignore it. The Dark Lord is more important right now. Leave the Muggles to their amusements. March 15, 1996, 1938. 43Z, the HUD in the fighter pilot's visor, reported that it had picked up the signal from the infrared beam. He pressed the button, and the bomb fell into the night. It was tracking beautifully. He shouted into the communicator, "Emerald City, this is Dorothy. The house is in the air. The house is in the air. 8 or 90 seconds and counting." March 15, 1996, 1938. 53Z, the red light appeared on Jacob Gold's wristwatch. The bomb was away. He hunkered down, took off the infrared goggles, and braced himself for the explosion. March 15, 1996, 1939-21. Z now, the faux glass suddenly perked up. It was ghostly and fuzzy. People unfamiliar with Muggle technology would likely have just passed it off as a shadow. However, Snape knew better. It was a missile or bomb, and judging by the size of it, a big one. He feigned a look of concern. Turning to Voldemort, he said, "Sir, I'd like to scour the grounds to make sure there are no Muggles or wizards eavesdropping on us. I'll be back in a moment. If you don't hear me come back in, say, 5 minutes, come and help, as I'll be in danger." Voldemort nodded. "Be my guest, Severus. We'll hold off on the grand finale until you come back." With that, Snape apparated out of there. He reappeared on a hill about a mile away where he would have a good view of the target zone. March 15, 1996, 1939. 53Z, the helicopter lurched forward, nearly throwing Arthur out of his seat and ramming his head into the soldier in front of him. As he rubbed his head, the pilot spoke once again into his helmet. "Roger, Emerald City. The house is in the air and is about to touch down. Lion is on the move. Scarecrow has evacuated." March 15, 1996, 1940. 12Z, Bellatrix Lestrin saw something out of the corner of her eye. What the March 15, 1996, 1940. 13Z, the center of the graveyard erupted in a pillar of flame. Rocks flew all over the place, followed by charred body parts. The concussion nearly deafened Jacob and the rest of the SAS men. Yet they held their positions. They had no idea if any of the wizards had survived the attack. Quivering with anticipation, they waited for the explosion to subside. Meanwhile, they received a message from Wizard that he was all right. March 15, 1996, 1940. 33Z. The smoke had cleared enough for Jacob to get a first glimpse of the results of the attack. There were bodies everywhere. No one had been left standing. The Death Eaters had been caught completely off guard. There was only one remaining infrared heat source which hadn't been accounted for. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew it wasn't one of the wizards. It was only 2 or 3 feet long and near the center of the explosion. Probably some burning grass, he thought. Nothing to worry about. So far, so good. March 15, 1996, 1942. 17Z, the helicopter arrived on the scene to survey the damage. There was a huge crater in the ground where the bomb had hit. Dawlish ordered the pilot to fly a little lower to check things out. The SAS men got their guns at the ready in case there were any surviving wizards. However, there was no resistance. Better and better. Arthur and the pilot made a cursory inspection from a few hundred feet. Death Eater marks were everywhere, many still attached to charred faces. They did a body count. All of the Death Eater masks were accounted for. Everyone was dead. As for Voldemort, he'd been right at the center of the blast. There was no way he could have survived that. He had almost certainly been vaporized, and the Tin Men had reported that he had still been there when the bomb had come in. The pilot looked at the crew and cheered. Seconds later, Dawlish and the SAS men joined them. One man brought out a victory cigar. The chant rang through the night. Ding dong, the witch is dead. Buried in a mound of rubble, a deformed creature the size and shape of a human baby played dead.